My name is Sandra Carlson, and I'm here in the Heritage Center in Tualatin with Mike Lofton, who is video recording this oral history interview with Ilga Ross. And today's date is September 14th, 2022. So thank you, Ilga, for being here. Welcome. Could you start by telling us where you live now and then where you were born?
Well, thank you. I find it rather interesting that you have invited me to this. I think I'm, as far as a Tualatin resident, I think I must be kind of ordinary, but I am a little bit unique in where I was born and where I came from. So right now, we've lived in, my husband Ron and I have lived in Tualatin for 38 years. We first moved here because I was employed. I had a job offer from Portland Community College. It's the Sylvania campus in the math department. And that turned out to be an absolutely wonderful and fitting profession for me. So he, at the same time, received a job offer at McMinnville. And so, being math teachers, we both decided that in order to facilitate our transit back and forth to work, we drew a straight line pretty much between my campus and where he was going to work at the high school in McMinnville, and settled on a few communities where we would look for our home. And Tualatin was a very good place to be because we had some priorities. We wanted a two-car garage. We had a son. We still have a son. And interestingly enough, he wanted sidewalks. That was very important to my husband. Sidewalks and buried utilities, and we were fortunate to find just a fitting home in the Apache Bluffs area. That's across from Winona Cemetery. And so that has been an interesting spot that we lived at for, pretty close to 30 years. And then at that point, I wanted to have a place where we could walk to facilities, and so I kept my eye out for when there would be a place in Tualatin. We didn't want to leave the community, but in Tualatin that had public transportation and good walking accessibility to all kinds of services, you know, food stores and so forth, library. And so we were fortunate enough to find a townhouse near the lake. And that's where we live now. Now I need to go back to where I originated, is that correct?
Yes, yes, please.
I'm being guided here this morning by Sandra. What makes me unique? So that portion of it was pretty ordinary. A job brought us here. We enjoyed the community. We stayed in the community. My early history is the unique part. I was born in Marbach-Neckar in Germany, right following World War II. My parents met right at the end of World War II. My father grew up in Latvia, Riga, Latvia, and my mother was German. And they met because my dad, being in Latvia, I don't know if you know much about the history of Latvia, but they were an independent country following World War I. And then Soviet Russia took over that country. They had a horrible, terrible time under communism for about a year. And then the German armies advanced, and so they were under German control for a while. And then the tide turned again on the war, and it was time for my dad to make a decision. Was he going to stay in Soviet-occupied Latvia, or would he leave? And he decided to leave, having experienced that horrible, horrible year where people were deported and murdered. So he departed and he fled west, arriving in Germany. My mother and dad met in a bomb shelter, actually. I think my dad was billeted there at one of the homes, and my mother lived across the street. It was a situation where not every cellar could be designated a bomb shelter, and there was one that was across the street that was buried quite deeply into the mountain, and so therefore that was designated as their local bomb shelter. And my mother was widowed, as the situation was in Nazi Germany. All the men had been conscripted, and they had been sent to the front, and so of course most of them that whole generation perished. So there they were, sitting next to each other in the bomb shelter, and I think there must have been a little attraction immediately. I mean, they were of the age, they were in their upper 20s, and so they met there. And so after not too long, they decided they would marry. And not too long after that, a year after that, I was born in 1946. And I was born right there in Marbach at the hospital. And we lived there until I was 4 years old. In the intervening time, like everybody, you had to find work, you had to find things to do. Luckily, Marbach was not destroyed because they were of no strategic value. And the other positive thing that happened is they were in American-occupied territory, which was, as I understand, a very positive thing. So Dad had been attending university in Latvia, and at the time he'd been studying chemistry and factory development, that kind of thing, engineering. Which, of course, after the war, there were no factories, there was nothing. And so he turned to study construction and drafting. And through that, he then got a job with the U.S. Air Force. And at the time, they were busy, the U.S. Air Force was busy constructing barracks. And so that's what he worked on. Well, shortly after a period of time, the barrack construction was completed, so he was out of a job. He then applied for a building inspector job there in Marbach. We were living at the time with my grandparents and my aunt. So we were all living in the same house, which was rather unique in a way because most Germans didn't own their homes, and my grandfather had many years before that determined that they wanted to actually buy a house.
And it was a 1700?
Yes, that house, when they took the stucco off of it and refurnished it, the house had been built in, there was a 1720 had been carved into the beam. Yeah, it was an interesting house. Every time we go to Germany to visit, I still have a cousin living there, first cousin, my aunt's son. We go to walk by the house because they don't own that anymore. But it was interesting. It had a shed, and I remember even as a little child, my grandmother, there was a cellar, and my grandfather kept his sauerkraut down there. He kept, well, you wouldn't know. It's Most, which was fermented quince juice, and that was down there. Then the next level, street level, they had a chicken coop, and above that was the living quarters, and living room, kitchen, I think one bedroom, and above that they had 2 more bedrooms. So that was it was kind of a nice house for an old time house.
But it was a hard time, wasn't it, right after the war?
Oh, it was incredibly difficult. I remember my mom saying that the food was rationed. She said they went to bed and their stomachs would rumble and they couldn't sleep due to hunger. They were rationed to 1 egg per person per week, and mostly I received that egg, so they were taking good care of me. Yeah, I had 5 adults around me, and they just spoiled me terribly. So, yeah, it was a good time for me to grow up. I was, of course, oblivious to all of these hardships that were going on.
You did mention your mother being, I guess, at night in the coal cars.
Oh, yes.
What she would have to
Yes,
do.
you know, because I was 4 years old and subsequently, some of these stories, you hear stories from your parents, and you can't really figure out the timeline, and that's what I can't really figure out. They had a time right after the war where the electricity was rationed. They were only able to have a 20-watt bulb, one 20-watt bulb. They'd had that hanging over the table in the living room, and that's all they were able to have as light in the evening. For heat. Again, I don't know the sequence of this or exactly when it happened, but they went at night, Mom and Dad went at night and went into the empty coal cars and scraped out what was left of the coal residue in order to use it at home to burn in the stove to keep warm. So those were some really difficult times. You know, in my generation, you don't ask people who went through such horrible experiences to really tell you. You need to wait until they actually share it with you under certain circumstances, because I think that those horrible experiences, they don't want to stir those up. They want to keep those quiet. It's just recently that I've done some research regarding what happened in Latvia in that year of Soviet occupation. And it was absolutely terrible. And my dad never told me about that. He just never said anything about it. It was just a period of his young life that he didn't talk too much about. He told us more about his father and when he was a young boy and things like that.
And so there was a time, so you're this little child with
Mhm.
5 adults
Yes.
adoring you and indulging you. But then there was a time when your father had to go away from Moorbach for work.
Well, he was traveling. The barrack construction for the U.S. Air Force was away. He was not living. He would come home on weekends. So he did do that. He actually had a U.S. Army uniform. It was during the time of the Berlin airlift. He's terribly proud of his pin, you know, his airlift, Berlin airlift. He thought that was a very good thing to do to help those people in Berlin, because of course they were starving and they had the Soviets surrounding them too, the Russians. So that was that portion. Well, like I was saying, so there was no work. He did apply for building inspection. He was not selected, and my mother thinks it's because he was a foreigner. Well, he was well educated. My dad spoke 4 languages, including English that he learned at school. I think that he mentioned at one point that took him, that helped him a lot during the war and after the war. He would frequently, he had a place to live, but a lot of his Latvian friends were in displaced persons camps. So we know about camps, we've seen them on television now, but there were displaced persons camps. And he would go there, and he was able to translate and help the people because he did know those 4 languages. He spoke Russian, Latvian, German, and English. So he was able to do that. My mother was a very smart woman. However, she did not have an education beyond the 8th grade. She finished, 8th grade was free education at the time in Germany. Of course, now they have college free education. But she finished her 8th grade right during the Depression. And her mom and dad could not afford to send her further to school. Excuse me.
And I think you said, yeah, she had worked for a time in, was it in Marbach?
Yes. Well, it wasn't exactly in Marbach. It was, the towns are pretty close together. Germany has very good transportation, public transportation. And so when she had to leave school, she applied for a wasn't an internship. I've lost the word, I'm sorry. Anyway, she was hired on as a trainee at a clothing factory at a nearby town, slightly larger. And so she was, what she did initially was she was a runner. She would take pieces of clothing, the cut pieces of clothing from one spot to the sewing ladies. And she would supply them with the pieces and to put that together. And she said, well, she pretty soon realized that there wasn't much advancement on the manufacturing floor, and so she gradually worked her way up into the office, and she became a payroll clerk. She was, like I said, she was a number person. My dad was a number person. I guess I'm a number person too. You know, I think there's a kind of an interest in that area. So, but like I said, she was extremely smart. But at the time that I was a child, she only did some part-time work. She did waitressing at a cafe and things like that, but she was no longer able to earn very much. Dad didn't have a job, and having been associated with the U.S. Air Force, that gave us the opportunity to immigrate. So he put in an application for that, and once we were accepted, I might mention this, that you know, the United States has a visa system where they will take certain categories of people, and people that were displaced from the Baltics had priority because, for one thing, they were mostly highly educated people. And the United States was, of course, interested in having their newcomers contribute to society and to the economy. Oh, I think there was one other thing that did happen. There was a monetary reform. My mother had worked up the whole time. She was not a stay-at-home mom or a stay-at-home person at all. She wasn't a housewife. So she had amassed a pretty good savings account. You know, she'd saved her money. And then there was monetary reform, which meant that, if you can imagine this, your savings were reduced to 10% of what you had before. And that's what caused my dad to not be able to complete architecture school. So anyway, money was scarce, and as a lot of people, you're looking for a better life and you're looking for a job. And as a consequence, when this came up, the opportunity to immigrate, that's what they took. So we were in a couple of camps in preparation for that. I don't remember much about it. I have a visual memory, and I have glimpses of some things that I mentioned in my brief bio. I remember walking through, Mom and Dad were holding my hands. We were walking through a field of grass and clover. And in the middle, all of a sudden, Dad looked down and said, "Look, well, here was some 4-leaf clovers." And there were 3 of them. So we picked 3 of them, 4-leaf clover for each one of us. I still have mine. And we felt that was pretty good luck. The other thing I remember is that the Red Cross gave children little boxes of things. In one box, I think there was clothing, and I had a skirt with suspenders that was quite nice. Children were also given a snack every afternoon, and I think I remember liking the rice pudding, but one day we had noodles seasoned with sugar and cinnamon, and that was terrible stuff. So I remember that too. You know, you remember the good, you remember the, oh, yuck. Well, then apparently, and again, this was part of my research, I of course don't remember so much of that stuff, the sequence of things. Then we were moved to a different camp when we were advanced, and we had to wait there. That was in Bremerhaven, which is actually the port city for departure. So we were in that camp there.
And you didn't know when you would be called to?
No, not exactly.
Transport.
You had to wait for a sponsor. Someone in the United States or organization had to sponsor you. And so we were waiting there. And I do know my mom wrote back to her parents that the food was better in this location. And eventually they told us, and she wrote back and she said, well, they posted the departures, and she said, we're not on this next transport. We're just going to have to wait until August. And at that point, then I think it was August 3rd or something like that, that we actually left.
And that was in 1950?
That was 1950, yes. So I was 4 years old.
And you were on I think you wrote, you were transported on a
yes, it was a troop
ship?
transport. It was a troop transport that had not been refitted. It was the SS McRae. And they had, and I do remember the women and children were in one large area, and the men were separated into another. And I remember how that we had canvas bunks. It was like pipes that went from the floor to the ceiling, and in between they had placed canvas bunks. So the ship had not been refitted from the period of time where it was transporting the troops back and forth. I do remember that. Mom and I don't think we were at the very bottom one, but we used one in between there. And I remember that we went to, my husband and I toured an immigration museum, and they had this other kind of cabin. I said to Ron, I said, this is not what this looked like. I remember what it looked like. So I was really curious, and I did search online, and I found a photograph of the way the troops had been housed in this ship. So I was correct. It was not the comfortable little cubbyhole cabin that they had on display.
And you were down there, you were up on deck a lot.
Oh yeah, we did. My mother said, we need to go up on deck. We need to go up on deck. We don't want to be seasick. We don't want to stay down here. And I remember that people were it was pretty awful, apparently. People were seasick, a lot of people. But we went upstairs to the deck and we're out and got the fresh air. And I don't recall that we were ever seasick. Part of the responsibility on the ship was that the men were given jobs to work. And I remember we ran into my dad and he was swabbing a deck at one point. So that was kind of an interesting thing. We were, of course, extremely happy to see him again, having been separated. When we went up on deck, I had one playmate, a little Jewish boy, Orthodox Jew, because he had the curls that they would wear. So he was already wearing those curls. And we played. We had a good time, apparently. I remember jumping around and doing whatever 4-year-olds do.
And you experienced a hurricane while you were
Yes,
on the ship.
that was a little bit later. First, we stopped at New York City. And I don't know exactly how many of the passengers got off there. The Jewish family did get off in New York City. I think maybe 2/3. But we were to go to New Orleans. And it was at that time that I remember that we did go through a hurricane. It was August, and that's not unusual. I had to look that up again too. It was Hurricane Baker, and it was not a really strong hurricane, but we sure were shook up and turned around and bounced up and down. And in fact, we had to hold for a while because there was a ship that had put out a mayday call. And so we stood by until they were rescued. It was a large container, some kind of a ship that was having some difficulty. And then we went on, and we landed in New Orleans.
And that was after 3 weeks, I think you
The
said.
21st. We
21st of
arrived the
August.
21st of August.
So about 3 weeks on that ship.
Yeah. Well, it wouldn't be that much. It would be, but it was a fairly lengthy time. Yeah, yeah.
And it was Fort Worth, Texas, were you?
Well, it was.
New Orleans.
We were in New Orleans. We had some interesting experiences. We didn't have a nickel to our name, and my parents recounted how this kind sailor bought a Coke for me. The other experiences that I recounted was, of course, it was segregation time, and my dad had to be warned off to not drink out of the colored water fountain. The fountain for white people's over there. This was all a new experience. You know, this is really interesting. The racial situation in the United States is a very interesting phenomenon in this country, and it's unknown in Europe. I'm not saying there's no prejudice or racism in Europe, but it's not of the same type. And so this was quite a surprise to Mom and Dad. A similar thing happened. We were at that point we were sponsored by a congregational church in Colorado Springs, and so we were on the train headed from New Orleans through Texas to Colorado. And being a little child, I had to go to the bathroom just terribly badly. And the toilets in our car were occupied, but I had to go badly. So Mom said, well, come on. And she grabbed my hand and we went into the next car. And the next car was full of African-American ladies, dressed to the nines. She remarked on that. She says, they were just dressed. Here we were, with our European clothing and probably not very much because we couldn't take very much with us. And we're walking through the colored car to their bathroom. They were shocked. I mean, my mom said, well, it was of necessity. So I don't know. It was quite a situation. Well, we arrived then in Denver. I think it was Denver. And the minister picked us up from the Congregational Church. We were then taken to a La Forêt church camp. It was the camp that they had in the summer in a wooded area near Colorado Springs. They had provided a place for us to live, and that turned out to be a log cabin, a real log cabin where the chinks occasionally were missing. And so at night, my mom said you could actually just look outside through the chinks in between the logs. It was quite a shock to Mom. We had an outhouse. We did not have running water in the house. Well, we did. We had cold running water if you pumped it. It was one of those hand pumps. There was a hand pump outside. And it was in the midst of this forest. There were no neighbors. Now you can imagine what my mother felt like on a situation. She was a city girl. She had a house that had hot water, running water, I believe, and indoor facilities. And so there we were out in the middle of nowhere. German was her only language. And I don't know how they did it. I honestly don't know how they did it. It was a huge adjustment. I mean, they were people who, they enjoyed going to operas. They had a social life. And here they were in the middle of nowhere. Dad worked as a caretaker for the church camp, fix-it man. And during the camp session that summer, my mother helped in the kitchen, so she did meet some people. So we were there, and I didn't have any children to play with. I did learn to read that year. I had a German reading book. What's nice is German is very phonetic. And then Mom and Dad also got me comic books, Donald Duck and so forth. And of course there's a lot of bang, pop, pow kind of words in there, which are also phonetic. And the minister said, no, that's not the best reading material for a child. Well, they didn't care. They knew I was reading, and so I learned to read at quite a young age.
And eventually you were living there in Colorado in a community of displaced persons, of immigrants? Well,
of immigrants. The sponsorship actually ended after a year. The Congregational Church planned that they would have us there for a year, and then they would sponsor another family. Well, we just were not settled yet, and so my dad asked, couldn't we please live in the house another year? Which they said yes, they would, and as long as we paid them rent, paid $30 rent. My dad got a job. There was a German family that we became acquainted with that helped us, helped Dad buy a car. It was a very old car. I think it was a 1939 Chevy. And so my dad was able to start working in Colorado Springs itself. And he got a job in a laundry. So here he was, a very educated person, but like many immigrants, had to start working with a menial job. It was interesting to me to go and visit him there. And we got to go on Saturdays, we got to go into town. He worked half a day. And the big washer and so forth. As a child, that's very interesting. So anyway, he worked for another year. At that point, we were able to afford this tiny little travel trailer, and he had met some other German people in, it was near a called Houston. It's just north of Colorado Springs. It's a rural community, and we were able to buy, it was a family who had immigrated from Germany a long time before, you know, probably after World War I. It was sometime there. They were from Bavaria, and they had a farm there. So they sold us an acre of land for $1, I think it was, and Dad started building our house on that location. Turns out across the street was another couple. They were actually from Austria. And they were running all kinds of interesting businesses. They'd been there for a lot longer. They had a bookstore in town. They had a reweaving, which my mom ended up working at and learning to. It was called invisible mending. And if you know, back then, people bought fairly expensive clothing, but they all smoked. And they would drop their ashes on their clothing. So people had holes in their clothes that needed to be repaired. And so my mother learned how to do that. So she did invisible mending. And they also had a rental home, and they had another German family come and live about a year later. So we had this little German-speaking enclave right there. Later on, I got to thinking, I wonder what the other ranching neighbors thought of having all these Germans in their midst, you know.
And so that, you were there through your high school years?
Oh, no. I did start school there. It was it's right where the Air Force Academy is located, near where the north entrance is. And so when the U.S. decided that they needed an Air Force Academy, they selected that land and took it by eminent domain. So in 1956, by then my dad had gotten a job as architectural designer with a building company. And that's where he worked pretty much the rest of his life. So he was actually in the field in which he was trained. At that point, he had been working for this architectural design company in Colorado Springs. And so when the Air Force came in and took the land there, then we moved into town. We were able to have a house built by the construction company. So that's where, I did start school, had a school bus, started school. We were bused into about 13 miles to a town north, it was called Monument Palmer Lake School District. That's where I started school. Went there, and in my 5th grade year, actually I should tell you that I skipped a grade. I started in 1st grade. One other interesting thing about that situation, here it was 1951, somewhere in there, 1952 I guess, that I started 1st grade. And there's a picture of me dressed pretty much like I am today. I'm wearing pants, which is kind of unusual. You know, girls for many, many years were not allowed to wear pants to school. I'm wearing pants and a sweater. And I think maybe that's been my costume the rest of my life. In the 5th grade is when we had to move, and so then we moved into Colorado Springs. And so I completed my education there. I went through elementary school a year, and so we were in the city, and graduated from Palmer High School in Colorado Springs. So after that, I went to college at the University of Northern Colorado, and it was during our college time that I met my husband. He'd actually graduated already. He went to Colorado State University. He had already graduated. Now I was aiming to be a math teacher, all right? That was my goal. And I met this guy and trying to find out about him. And, well, he had just graduated. He was going to be a math teacher. He had a job. And I said, hey, this guy has some real possibilities. You better pursue him for a little while and try and figure out if he's the one for you. And as it turned out, yes, when I graduated then college, he'd already gotten a job in Wyoming, in Gillette, Wyoming. And they also hired me. So we were both there in Gillette, Wyoming. Gillette's a very, very isolated community. So at that point, you know, I was a city girl because of growing up with most of my years then in Colorado Springs. And we moved to Gillette, population about 5,000 people. It was in a county that had no other towns. The county was 50 miles wide, 100 miles long, and it was pretty isolated out there. But they had their own little social life, and so you participate and you do things. It was a very good place to be young, you know? It was a very good place to be young. Because in Wyoming, with such a small population, everybody is kind of important. And there's always something that they're asking you to do, and you have opportunity to do things. So that was rather important. We went through quite an experience there as far as the schools. When we went there, like I said, it was a small population, and by the time we left there, the population had grown to 15,000. The first thing that happened was an oil boom. So we had all kinds of people come in from all over to do this oil drilling. And then the next thing that happened, we had a coal boom. They had strip mining of the coal because the coal seams were very, very close to the surface. So the process was to simply take off the overburden, dig out the coal, and put the stuff back over the top. But once those natural, well, one thing that did happen that was very good is that there was a lot of money that came in to the county and into the schools, tax money, from the coal and oil industries. So we were pretty affluent as far as schools. After we had lived through this overcrowding, you know, when we had no buildings, we were seating children in the hallways. So that was an interesting experience. We both got involved in our education union. We both got involved in politics. I got involved in the American Association of University Women. Once that our son was born, he was born in 1974, I stopped teaching and became involved in community volunteerism, all kinds of volunteerism. And so there was so much volunteerism that I felt overwhelmed a little bit. I had started teaching part-time at the community college, the local community college, which was actually just an extension from another one. We were just on an extension location. But I really liked that. And so when our son was 10 years old, I said, you know, I'd like to go back to work permanently. And they didn't hire me back in the school district, which was actually a good thing. Well, you see, in the time in between, I had earned a master's degree. I was a rather expensive hire. And this happens to women in general. They will stop out to raise their family, and when they try to enter the workforce again, it's very difficult. So a very good thing happened. I didn't get hired in Wyoming, and And I said to Ron, well, you know, we never intended to live in Wyoming permanently, did we? When we first married, didn't we decide that it was a time where teachers would go and they'd teach for 2 years and then they'd move somewhere else? Well, I'd been there 16, he'd been there 20 years, you know, and I said, well, no, we actually didn't intend to stay this long. He said, okay, if you get a good permanent community college job elsewhere, we will move. Well, gosh, was I fortunate, you know? Those jobs are scarce. Those jobs are scarce. The permanent ones are very scarce. And so I was very, very fortunate to get this job at Portland Community College. And then he struggled to find his job in McMinnville. He kept getting told, oh, Mr. Ross, you have all these wonderful math credentials. You'll get a job in no time. Well, it was rather difficult. He looked all around, and finally he was hired in McMinnville. And he didn't leave there. He stayed there 20 years. So my husband had 20 years in Gillette and 20 years in McMinnville, and a man who could teach high school math for 40 years, I think I'm pretty impressed.
And your son went to school here?
Yes, yes. Interestingly enough, when we moved into, I'd mentioned we were at Apache Bluffs, but he was bused to Bridgeport Elementary, which is, of course, on the other side of the freeway near the hospital. So he was bused over there for some time because that's the way the boundaries were drawn. So that was fine. Then he went to Tualatin Junior High and Tigard High School because that was before the Tualatin High School was built.
Oh, so he didn't graduate from the Tualatin?
No, it wasn't there yet.
Okay.
It wasn't there yet, so all of our young people in Tualatin at that time were attending Tigard High School.
Yes, that's where I attended too, even though I lived in Tualatin.
Yeah. So about 2 years later, I think, is when Tualatin High School was opened. I'm not positive, but it seems like 2 or 3 years following that. He graduated from Tigard High School in 1992.
Okay. And he works here in Tualatin.
He does, although he's been working remotely for 2 years now, 3 years. Ever since he was hired by Lamb Research. He worked, well, he's got a long work history, actually. Well, I should tell you, he decided to go to college back in Colorado. He went to the University of Denver, and then he majored there. He majored in both math and engineering, mechanical engineering, and he had lots of offers for graduate school, lots of offers, and he wanted to go to New England. So he went to Dartmouth for a year, and that really did not suit him. I think we are, speaking in general about Western folks up and down the West Coast and the central of the country. We're different from East Coast folks. He said, you know, these undergraduates, they're like children. They're so immature. Anyway, it did not suit him. And so he came back and he finished his graduate degree at Portland State in mechanical engineering. First, he started working for Columbia Machine in Vancouver. And then he worked for a while at PGE, Portland General Electric. He enjoyed that work. They went out, what he was doing was he went and surveyed businesses for energy efficiency. That's what he was doing for PGE. And when that job ended, because they were under a contract with when that job ended, he was looking around for another job, and he was hired with Lamb's Research. He has it's difficult for me to know what he does, actually. I don't know. But he has a fancy title. He is the Global Energy Manager. Basically what he does is he buys electricity for them. So, yeah. And he's single. He still lives in downtown Portland. But he does come and visit us every week. So we usually have dinner together on Sundays. And we've been retired now. Ron and I retired in 2005. So we have had a long retirement. The first portion of that, my mother did come to live with us because my father had passed away. And so Mom spent her time with us here in Tualatin. So she was a Tualatin resident for 7 years. In fact, she passed away over here in Meridian Park Hospital. So she's got some official records right here in Tualatin also. So that was what we did, and we tried to travel. I enjoy traveling a lot. I enjoy history. That's why I am a member of Tualatin Historical Society. I think I got involved when this building was first being moved from its previous location. And I thought, that's a good idea. I'll donate some money to that. And so that's how I was involved with it initially. And I enjoy history very much. I've been doing genealogical research for a long time. My husband's family is very interesting. I found when the Rosses came to the United States from England, and I found when his mother's family, the Lewises, arrived in America, which was back in the 1600s. So when you do genealogical research, you find it attaches to history, and you want to put it into context with history. And I like to learn about what's happening and try to imagine what was happening with families. So that's my main hobby, other than my dad was a photographer, and he enjoyed that as his hobby. My grandfather, my father's father, was actually a professional photographer. He was Latvian, but he was commissioned to go to Moscow to photograph the Romanovs when they had their 300th year jubilee. So he was in Moscow at that time, and that's where he met my grandmother. She was actually a Russian. Yeah, so that history of the family is really quite interesting.
Well, your story, your history really spans a large part of the world, or
it does.
Europe,
it does.
The U.S., and what an interesting story.
I am probably one of the most genetically mixed Europeans you would find.
Latvian, German.
Yeah. Yes, I've had my. I did do my DNA, and it's accurate from what I know, because I think people are sometimes doing their DNA and finding very interesting things about their family that they had never known before. But mine is certainly accurate. Yeah.
Well, what an interesting story, and thank you, Ilga, for coming to share that with us. We're going to, we'll add it to our collection, and we'll eventually, it'll be available on our website, so that people who want to, research or just hear about your story will be able to view it, and then I think we'll, I need to have you sign a paper giving us permission to hold your interview and make it available. And of course, we do that in an ethical manner. If we were to do any major editing, you would we would ask your permission and share that with you.
Well, I find that frequently you're very surprised at the slant that a particular interview has taken. You know, you think, I really focused on this topic, whereas this actually is just as important in my life as the other. So, yeah.
Oh, well,
thank you for having me.
thank you.
It's quite an honor, actually.
Thank you and thanks for getting up in the morning. I'm not much of a morning person either. So no.
I just recently learned from a distant cousin that on my mother's side, our mutual great grandfather was a night watchman.
A night
A
watchman?
night watchman. He would watch in his village. And so he was a night watchman because she told me she's a night owl too. And so we're wondering she says, oh, great grandpa was a night watchman. So I don't know if it's hereditary, but I did read, it's really interesting that humankind has two kinds. We have the morning people, but we also have to have the night people who keep watch at night. So.
That's right, yes. Okay.
All right, thank you.
We're done, and I'll